All right, everyone. Thanks for joining the CTO Advisor and our webinar. Backups are dead. It's been a long month since I introduced this topic. I'm super excited about doing it, sharing my research in this area and talking to whether it's vendor clients or with enterprises struggling with this concept of moving past backups. A little introduction to myself. I'm the CTO advisor, the principal of CTO advisor, and at CTO advisor on Twitter. You can reach me via email, Keith at thectoadvisor.com. Quick career highlights. I've been in IT for, I hate to put it this way, for 3 decades. Started my IT career in the early 90s. Some highlights. I spent a couple of years as a program chief architect for a fairly large program within Lockheed Martin Department of Housing and Urban Development. Over about 12,000 end users. Managed the IT infrastructure from our architecture perspective for that fairly large organization. Moved on to PwC, where I was a management consultant and tackled problems from a very different lens than traditional IT. And then I spent a couple of years in a fairly large enterprise managing, again, the IT infrastructure for a multi-billion-dollar portfolio, the SAP system for that fairly large Fortune 200. You can find my content on techrepublic.com, the CTOadvisor.com, of course, YouTube, and Tech Target, as well as virtualizedgeek.com. So hopefully we won't take more than a half an hour of your time on a Friday. I know it's the end of the week. I really appreciate for those who are either joining the recording or joining this session live. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. But this whole concept got started. I was at of all things, a NetApp conference, NetApp Insight, and a keynoter from The Economist talked about data being the new oil. This is something that if you followed Facebook, Twitter, all of the large web scalers, it's not anything new. We've heard this concept. If you're not paying for the solution, you are the product. Your data is the information. So with these large web scalers, we've come to accept that as a fact. However, that is not the only case. It's not just the web scalers. I've noted a couple of large brands that are using data in interesting ways to become data-driven businesses. Capital One actually had a booth at AWS reInvent. GE has gone big into data. While they've had some financial troubles in the past, their commitment to data has not changed. Ford, again, is for the legacy auto builders are kind of moving the needle when it comes to the connected car. And then Southwest Airlines, of all people, some interesting stats from some of these major brands. A 737 MAX, which is the next generation Southwest Airlines plane from Boeing. Southwest has flown 737-700, 737-800s for quite some time. 737 MAX, the new generation, the turbines generate about 844 terabytes of data per day in a 12-hour operating period. That's just one aircraft over several aircraft in their fleet. So Southwest alone generates petabytes of data per day just off of their airline data, off their airplanes. So IoT is just generating this massive amount of data. I worked for a Fortune 200 pharma in which we were challenged with storing data off of these genome sequencers. The ability to sequence the human genome was broke some years ago. Average cost of, was some crazy number of $100,000 to sequence the genome. Now that number has come closer down to $1,000. So you have these sequencers running nonstop all day long to sequence several genomes a day at the tune of 200 gigabytes per sequence. And just to give some scope of, well, how many people will get their or will benefit from getting their genome sequenced? As we talk about target medicine and custom medicine, in theory, I visited a university in Oregon where they would like to see every new cancer patient have their genome sequenced so they could be identified for specific trials and treatments. There's 14.1 million new cancer patients a year. That's just the cancer use case. There's many other use cases for the human genome and having your genome sequenced other than cancer. So again, just the scale of these data sets. Autonomous vehicles, famously, this is probably one of the number one use cases. When you go to A16Z, they say the cloud is going to die because of IoT and the edge. 4 terabytes of data per autonomous vehicle per day. And then we're still not talking about the more common use cases that we see in many enterprises: security cameras, manufacturing equipment, wearables, door locks, etc. Abundance of IoT data is generating a ton of data in our enterprises. So this is not just the big web scalers that are worried about massive amounts of data. If you manage storage, you are accustomed to constantly requesting new data or new disk and data services because of the explosive growth in this data sources just from IoT alone. So what's done with all of this data? Well, I was just at AWS reInvent last week, and AWS did a fabulous job promoting AWS services, one of which was the Deep Lens, in which they take this IoT connected camera, use AI to identify. They had a really cool hack at the event where you could identify a hot dog, and hot dog, not hot dog. Obviously, simple use case, but these services grow. I was at, again, a farmer which used this methodology of collecting massive amounts of data out of their SAP system and their commercial sales in general to identify the most at-risk patients that needed the high touch and custom contact of a practicing nurse. So early on in the sale of this product, they'd have every new patient contacted by a nurse. As this sales of these pharmaceuticals grew into the billions, while the financial math worked out that they could continue to hire nurses, they just simply can't hire that many nurses to contact that many patients. So they had this bottleneck in which they needed some level of intelligence to reach out and say what patient should be contacted. Using KPIs and this massive amount of data they had collected on their patients before, in consultation with their doctors and providers, they were able to target and create call lists of employees to call. So cloud services such as TensorFlow, Watson, Azure AI, AWS have become the engine for drilling this data oil. Some employers or organizations go at it on their own. They may create a GPU farm. So they may take open source TensorFlow and actually build their own AI ML on-prem and process that data and leverage that data if they believe that's the differentiating service to build their own AI farm. They may do that on-prem. And then there's global employees. People are smart no matter where they're at. AWS was obviously a huge conference, but Alibaba also had a huge cloud conference just a few months ago. Talent is spread across the world. Microsoft is making big investments in development houses in India. We're seeing other third world countries such as Russia grow. Israel has a really great startup environment. The V Brown Bag guys were just in Israel doing a Revelo Systems build day. Employees are global, and this is just not from a technology perspective. You look at R&D. There's people doing amazing things when it comes to Alzheimer's research in Germany. There's a great deal of oncology expertise on the West Coast. The East Coast specializes in a certain type of medical research, and they all need the same genomic data. That brings us to the problem that many of these new vendors are trying to solve. And while backup itself is dead, backup is just a feature of data protection. The thing that you want to look for critically that actually adds business value and brings to life or brings to value the oil that's buried deep into our data are the metadata and the services associated with that data. We have to get the data in the hands of the researchers. We have to get the data to AWS. We have to get the data to Germany from New Jersey. We have to get the data to Google in their TensorFlow. We have to get it to our own cloud, our own private cloud of HPC and GPUs and MI and ML and AI. We can't do this the way we've done it in the past. I'm sure many of you have gotten on a plane with a set of data, whether it's on some DOT tape drives or some DOT tapes or some portable drives, and carried that to another site because it was faster than copying it over the network. We can't do business like that any longer. The speed of business dictates that we do things much faster. So basic features we're looking for in our quote unquote backup solutions, which are now called data protection solutions, are simple things such as copy data. If I need to refresh Oracle database from production to QA, and QA can be in AWS, it can be in Revelo Systems, it can be in your DR facility, it can be right next to your copy of your production data, right next to your production systems. If we need to make a copy of that data, we can no longer afford to make a basically zero level backup that data and restore that data and take up all that disk space. One, we have the simple problem of time. It takes time to copy that much data. Two, we have the challenge of disk space. We can't continue to just simply buy more disk in order to accommodate new copies of data for text, QA, development. And then a third issue is just the speed of replication. We can no longer afford to give up private data center space in the case of on-premises resources for these ancillary copies of data. We want to put that stuff in a cloud. We want to use the elasticity of the cloud to say that, you know what, I want to spin up a QA or a test environment for a few hours or a few days and then tear that down and not incur the cost of maintaining that environment all the time. Copy data allows us to do that. Caching, getting data from one side of the world to another side of the world or in another data center. Basically, the ability to smartly place data where we think that data is going to be accessed. replication for DR and for backup in DR. So, one of the primary drivers I read the other day, one of the primary drivers for cloud is still disaster recovery. We want to still run VMware on-prem, focused on production, replicate those data sets out to AWS, Google Compute, or Azure, and bring up our DR environment as needed, again, without incurring the cost of running those CPU instances constantly in that tier 1 storage when we don't need it. And all of that is powered by, we want to take advantage of this new concept of, relatively new concept of object storage in S3. How can we do this relatively inexpensive? If we can spin up, generically speaking, we can take a copy of a system running in our production environment, create an equivalent EC2 instance with some block storage, some EBS block storage in AWS, and take a simple product like Double Take and just replicate real time the data between environments. Simply spoken, that's the old way of doing things. It's expensive and it's ineffective. At some point, we'll run out of bandwidth and it doesn't scale. So we're looking at ways to leverage object storage, which is much cheaper, a little bit less performant, but less cheaper than traditional block storage. These are the challenges, and these are the capabilities we want our backup solutions to provide. Then outside of just practical technology and the value add that comes from moving data around the world and within regions, there's the regulatory concerns. If you haven't heard, GDPR goes into effect May 2018. This is the European Union's efforts to make sure that each European Union citizen has the right to be forgotten. If you're joining this webinar from the US and you think, oh, this isn't a concern of mine, it is. If you do business with a European Union citizen, and if you do business in Europe in general, you are in scope of GDPR. And the penalties are severe, up to 4% of global profits. So if you think about some of the penalties that Microsoft and Google have suffered from the right to be forgotten, each one of those instances. So if there's 10, as the way I understand it, if there's 10 instances of violations of the GDPR, for each instance, the entity can be penalized 4%, not just of the European profits, but of the global profits. This is going to be tested for sure in court, but the EU does not seem to be letting up and saying, you know what, we're going to give an additional grace periods. For everything that I've seen and read, they fully expect to implement this in full or start to enforce it in full beginning in May. And then there's simply data sovereignty within your organization. You may have concerns about where data is stored. You may, if you're in the EU, you may be, especially with Brexit, you may be concerned that is data stored in EU union data centers versus in the UK, or even we're seeing that the Ireland may be treated differently. So data locality, knowing where your data is at, not just your production data, your archive and backup data, or even your replication data for DR, it's important to know to have tagged that data and know where that data are at. This secondary market, I like to call it secondary storage. All the players that we're going to get into in the next slide deal into this ideal of secondary storage. How do you leverage what had been considered a backup feature as more of a data management solution? How do we manage the data that we have across the globe? So let's talk about the players in the industry. So just a few weeks ago, I was at Commvault Go, and they have a solution, Hyperscale. It is the traditional Commvault solution, but we've seen especially in the data center space, an awful lot of vendors attack this traditional Dell EMC, who's on the slide, their data domain business, where you have these scale out data domains, or you scale out storage units in which you can continually expand your backup solution to accommodate the growth in space. You know, we had this problem when we first started to back up the disk. It's an expensive and hard to manage solution. What happens when you expand across a single direct attack set of storage? Well, a practical problem that you have is that that solution isn't balanced. So you may have 18 months of backup on one scale out node, and you add a second one. Well, that new scale out node, you might put new backups on, but now you have this you have this failure domain in which if you lost one node, you lose 18 months of backup. That was the old approach. So data domain and all these new solutions automatically refactor your backups across multiple scale out units. Commvault has introduced a solution built on Red Hat cluster file system that allows for the expansion across nodes. Very traditional solution, taking on a new approach. They also have a cloud version of this solution that allows you to replicate to the cloud. So exact same solution that you have on-prem, you can have in AWS. Druva Inc. is a born in the cloud backup solution that's focused on the end user. They have their original solution was about 75, has a customer with 75,000 backups. I mean, 75,000 end users. So think about it, traditional laptop backups. How do I get that user specific data, the OSTs, the Word documents, that critical data that's on the end user's device into a backup solution? That was their foray into the industry. They've since expanded into the data center and now backing up VMs, specifically VMware vSphere. Datos.io. Datos.io is really interesting solution in the sense that, you know what, they make no qualms about it. They are focused on non-relational databases, the Hadoops and the Cassandras of the world. How do you back up these distributed databases that may be on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud? Database-focused backup. Cohesity. Cohesity is an interesting solution. I talked to Robinson Rivera, the field CTO of Cohesity. They don't consider themselves a backup solution. They consider themselves a data management platform. You can use them natively to back up your environment. So again, traditional cloud or on-prem based workloads, data is backed up to a Cohesity virtual storage device. And you can use Cohesity software to back it up natively. So you can use Cohesity as the interface, or it can be a target for a product like Commvault. So a little bit best of both worlds, a little bit. You can use it as both a new school cloud-based solution. Albeit you still have challenges with concepts such as serverless, but you can back your EC2 instances up to Cohesity, or you can back up your traditional VMs on-prem to Cohesity, either on-prem and replicate that out to cloud-based instances. Rubrik is very similar in Cohesity. It's a scale-out solution. You can add bricks to the Cohesity platform to expand, to the Rubrik platform to expand capacity. But Rubrik is not claiming to be secondary storage platform in a way that Cohesity is. There's a lot of confusion between Cohesity and Rubrik. From my view, Rubrik is laser focused on backup as its initial use case. While you can use it for some of the replication and DR scenarios, it's specifically focused on that backup part of that, protecting data on-prem in the cloud, and they are not a backup target for a secondary piece of software. So they have no partnership with Commvault, for example, to be a target, a storage, NFS target for Rubrik. And then you have the father of this kind of whole market of Commvault, Cohesity, Rubrik is data domain. Dell EMC is not sitting back and letting Cohesity, Rubrik, and Commvault eat all of its lunch. It has also launched a cloud-based data domain to do replication up to data domain, up to the AWS cloud. They have some work to do. That we'll just leave it at that. There is some work to do. Then a non-traditional backup vendor, quote unquote backup, but data protection vendor, Datrium, which is a open converged system. They don't like to. I like to sometimes call them HCI. They don't like that name. They are an open converged system that's very similar in substance to a HCI. They're scale out x86. They have the concept of data nodes and storage nodes that you can mix and match for performance and capacity. And they recently came out with their cloud-based DVX. Datrium has data domain roots, in that a lot of the executives and developers come from data domain. So they've inherently put a lot of that capability in their open converged platform. Doesn't go down to the cloud level for backups, so you would still need a backup solution, but they replicate out to AWS. You can have a cloud-based DVX system, their open converged system, in the cloud, and have that as a target of your on-prem DVX open converged system to replicate data to. Very interesting solution. Then, of course, we can't forget the gorilla in this whole VM data center space, Veeam. Veeam is a well-known solution, VM-based. They integrate well with both VMware and Hyper-V. They've gone into cloud-based platforms. Veeam is a solid, privately owned, backup-focused entity that provides a VM-focused backup capability. All of these companies, at varying layers of degree, offer the capabilities we saw in the previous slides when it came to defeating data gravity or trying to beat the speed of light. You can't beat the speed of light, but each one of these companies offers some form of copy data, some layer of caching. Caching might be iffy with some of the newer born in the cloud solutions. Definitely replication, and every one of them support object storage to some degree. I highly recommend you engaging your sales team for each one of these organizations if you want to find out more about them. So as promised, we finished within a half an hour. Let's look at if there's any questions from the crowd. So Eugene Porter de Leon, I don't normally say names within webinar, but that's a cool name. So he asks, what is open converged? There's actually, if you visit the CTO Advisors YouTube page, I have an interview with the Datrium folks in which we talk about open converged. Interestingly enough, as far as I can tell, Datrium was the first company to use the term open converged. However, I've seen it otherwise, but if you just search for Datrium CTO Advisor on there, you'll see my interview with Datrium's CTO Hugo Patterson, and we talked through the whole concept of, I challenged him pretty good on what is the concept of open converged. A question, do you mention EMC DD and not HP Store once? You know what? That's a fair question. HPE Store once is another option out on the field. So blankly, all of your major vendors, I didn't mention everyone, and my apologies for HPE for not including them on the slide. HPE Store Once is definitely a software-based solution that has some compelling solutions. Thanks for that call out. Any other questions? All right. With that said, I appreciate you guys spending time stopping off. Oh, the question was, does data domain have any extra software advantages? You know what? I'm going to hold my tongue a little bit on the data domain question. I think one of the knocks against data domain is that it has been the leader in the space for so long. They revolutionized this concept of scale out disk-based storage. They are still the market leader. Would I say that they have software advantages? I would say, from the view of what of the criteria I laid out, I think Cohesity and Rubric is a little bit ahead of data domain, and specifically, I think that's a good challenging question to ask your Dell EMC rep of why should I still stay with data domain versus one of these new solutions from a technology perspective. Of course, they're going to give you the spiel about the power of the Dell brand and the Dell EMC support capability. That's all well and good, but ask about the innovation within the software. Why did Rubric win Best of Show at VMworld and Data Domain didn't? That is, I think, a great pointed question to ask. But good challenging question. All right. Any other questions? All right. I really appreciate the time. I appreciate the questions. This will be available for the recording will be available. So if you need to come back, reference it. I will send out a link to the slide share. Also, I failed to mention, or I failed to note on the vendor slide, that Datrium is also a CTO advisor client. So, just to be full disclosure. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend and a great holiday if I don't talk to you guys on Twitter.